The Diary of a Man in Despair. August 11th, 1936. I happened to be in Munich recently, just as one of the official festivals, which are by now an everyday occurrence, was being celebrated to the blare of tubas and the rat-tat of drums. I couldn't get a room at my usual hotel near the station, so I found a place to sleep in the old city, opposite the school in which a visiting Hitler youth troupe had been lodged for the holiday period. I saw one of these boys who had just thrown off his knapsack look about him in the empty classroom. I observed how his glance fell on the crucifix hanging behind the teacher's desk. How in an instant this young, still soft face contorted with fury, how he ripped this symbol to which the cathedrals of Germany and the ringing progressions of the St. Matthew Passion are consecrated off the wall and threw it out the window into the street with the cry, "Lie there, you dirty Jew." I've seen this. Among people I know, I have heard of more than one case of children denouncing their parents politically and thereby delivering them to the axe. My life in this pit is now entering its 5th year. For more than 42 months, I have thought hate, lain down with hate, dreamt hate, and awakened with hate in my heart. I suffocate in the knowledge that I am the prisoner of a horde of vicious apes, and I rack my brains over the perpetual riddle of how this same people can have sunk into this stupor and is incapable any longer of perceiving its shame for the shame that it is. I saw Hitler last in Saarbrück, slowly gliding by in a car with armor-plated sides, while an armed bodyguard of motorcyclists rode in front as further protection. A jelly-like, slag-grey face, a moon face into which 2 melancholy jet-black eyes had been set like raisins. Today, I hear that Hitler recently ended a report by Wilhelm Keitel, the army commander which had given him reason for dissatisfaction, by throwing a bronze vase at the head of the general. Isn't this the kind of thing that happens when a people is sinking in the cesspool of its own disgrace? I'm no mystic. I'm a child of my time, despite all forebodings, and I hold strictly to what I see. But what I saw gliding by there, like the Prince of Darkness himself, was no human being. I've met him a few times. First time I remember, 1920, at the home of my friend Clemence von Frankenstein. According to the butler, one of those present was forcing his way in everywhere. It was Hitler. He had managed an invitation to Clay's house under the guise of being interested in operatic scene design. Hitler very likely had the idea that theatrical design was connected to interior decorating and wallpaper hanging, his former profession. He'd come to the house where he'd never been before, dressed in gaiters, with a floppy, wide-brimmed hat, carrying a riding whip. There was a collie, too. The effect among the Gobelin tapestries and cool marble walls was something akin to a cowboy sitting down on the steps of a Baroque altar in leather breeches and spurs with a Colt revolver at his side. And eventually he managed to launch himself into speech. He talked on and on at us. He preached. He went on at us like a division chaplain in the army. We didn't contradict or venture to differ in any way, but he began to bellow at us. The servants thought we were being attacked and rushed in to defend us. When eventually he had left, we sat quietly, confused. It was a feeling of dismay, as when on a train you suddenly find that you're sharing a compartment with a psychotic. We sat a long time, no one spoke, until finally Clay stood up and opened one of the huge windows to let in the spring air. The fresh air did help to dispel the feeling of oppression. It wasn't that an unclean body had been in the room, but something else. The unclean essence of monstrosity. Yeah. I used to ride at the Munich Armory, after which I liked to eat at the Lowenbaukeller. That was the second meeting. At first glance, the tightly clenched insecurity seemed to be gone, which allowed him to launch at once into one of his tirades. I had ridden hard and was tremendously hungry and wanted just to be left alone to eat in peace. Instead, I had poured out over me every one of the political platitudes in his book, that Machiavellianism by which German foreign policy became a series of legalized burglaries and the activities of its leaders a succession of embezzlements, forgeries, and treaty breaches. This oily hair falling in his face as he ranted, he had the look of a man trying to seduce the cook. I got the impression of basic stupidity. The same kind of stupidity as that of his crony von Papen, the kind of stupidity that equates statesmanship with cheating at a horse trade. It was absolutely nothing. This happened in the 20 years since I first saw him to make me change my view of him. The fact remains that he basically hates himself and his opportunism, his immeasurable need for recognition, and his now apocalyptic vanity are all based on one thing: a consuming drive to drown out the pain in his psyche. Yes. The trauma of a monstrosity. There he sat, a raw vegetable Genghis Khan, a womanless Napoleon, a teetotal Alexander, an effigy of Bismarck, who would certainly have had to gone to bed for 4 weeks if he tried to eat just one of Bismarck's breakfasts. I'd driven into town, and since at that time, September 1932, the streets were already quite unsafe, I had a loaded revolver with me. In that almost deserted restaurant, I could have shot him. If I'd had an inkling of the role this piece of filth was to play, of the years of suffering he would make us all endure, I would have done it without a second thought, but I took him for a character in a comic strip and I didn't shoot. It had done no good anyway. Our martyrdom had already been decided. If he had at that point have been tied to the railway tracks, the train would have been derailed before it got to him. But when his hour strikes, the end will come down upon him from every possible direction. There are many rumors of attempts to assassinate him. The attempts fail. And they will continue to fail. For years it has seemed that God is asleep. May 1937. I'm writing this in the Berlin hotel, which is about as quiet and discreet as hearts are. Yeah. Pondering the great changes of the 19th century, I realize at the moment, 70 years ago, when Germany, in its infatuation with prosperity, agreed to let Prussia be its advisor and procurer, it went to the dogs. Prussia's estate, patched together out of bits and pieces, never meant to be a nation. To hold together the monstrous structure, the Prussians had to put all their energies into their military machine, as a result of which no middle class and no true caste of the learned could ever come into being. Here then is where the preference for the provisional and the second rate was born. This position towards ersatz can be seen in the Baroque trappings of the kings of Prussia, the gilded plaster of their palaces, accompanied by the demand, backed up by the gun, to please, if you will, be so good as to accept all this as solid and definitive and valid. Here then is where the eternal more originated. The deification of the threadbare, the cult of the ugly. This is the place where the eye-bulging hatred against everybody who had more originated. The ceaseless eyeing of other people's prosperity, the readiness to sudden banditry, and the drive to make this Prussian cult of the threadbare into the state religion of Germany. And they will, if other people prove recalcitrant, use their guns. And here I touch upon the central political problem facing Europe today. After the Prussian oligarchy, which at the very least was aware that it had responsibilities, disappeared, the men of Versailles were guilty of the incredible stupidity of dismembering Austria. After that, all that was needed was for Prussian greed to combine with a political condottieri, and the catastrophe which all of us knew was in the making was upon us. This may be a problem for Germany today, but tomorrow it will be a matter for Europe and the world to resolve. Time is fast approaching when Europe will have to decide whether it will let itself be engulfed or will finally defend its own heart from the Prussian drive for power. 9th September 1937. My friends have taken the occasion to give me a warning about my writings. Driven as I am by my own inner necessity, I must ignore these warnings and continue with these notes. Night after night, I had this record deep in the woods on my land, constantly on the lookout in case I am observed, constantly changing my hiding place, and this is how we live, my vanished friends. Do you, who left Germany 4 or more years ago, have any idea how completely without legal status we are? Of what it is to be threatened with denunciation at any time? Will you actually be able to grasp that flight was more comfortable than remaining at the dangerous outpost, an illegal watcher among the barbarians? Will you be able to grasp what it has meant to spend these long years with a heart filled with hate? Hate at lying down, hate at rising, and hate through the long hours of bad dreams. And all this while, without any rights under the law, without the smallest compromise, without a single Heil Hitler, without a single attendance at a meeting, whilst through it all the stigma of illegality sits on one's brow. Will we even speak the same language when this is over? We live in a gigantic spiritual vacuum. What are the words? The end of the world is at hand, which Dostoevsky wrote 70 years ago about a presentiment of the apocalyptic horsemen now thundering down upon us, and the prophecy of how utterly lost we have become. Surely Dostoevsky is right. The end of the world is at hand. March 20th, 1938. And now Austria. We saw it coming for weeks. We sensed exactly what it all meant, the threats and the staged riots, the whole shabby performance designed to provide a reason for intervention, and our tank and artillery columns are rolling down every street as though the enemy were a European great power and not a tiny nation of 7 million inhabitants. I see in this generalized brutality, this nasty satisfaction at the fate of the Austrian leaders, this general delight in ridicule and rape, something ignoble, which fills me with shame. Austria, poor eternally derided Austria, whose only sin was that until the end, and in the face of the attack by Greater Prussia, it held to one last recollection of the noble old holy Roman Empire. Why in the world did Schuschnigg not give the order to shoot in one last attempt to awaken the world from its incomprehensible lethargy? I foresee the day when the nations will regret their cowardly passivity. The cost will be beyond measure, but they'll have to pay it someday. In this first great breach of the peace, the criminal has been let go unpunished, and those of us inside Germany who are his only opponents are made weaker and more impotent. And what did everyone do? They stood around and they watched, and thus made impossible any resistance inside Germany. And what are they doing now? They're standing around and they're watching, preoccupied with figuring out a way to avoid irritating Herr Hitler. And so making even more impossible any resistance inside Germany. While I've been writing, a flight of bombers has been droning past overhead. This drone has gone on for a full hour. So the planes were flying against a world power. I'm a German. I encircle this land in which I live with all my love. Never again can I be torn from here without going to see it. I tremble for every tree and wood that disappears, for every silent valley that is devastated, for every river that these captains of industry, the real masters of our land, threaten. I will hate and curse you from my grave. And it will be your children and your children's children will have to bear my curse. I have no weapon against you but this curse, and I know that it withers the heart of him who utters it. I do not know if I will survive your downfall, but this I do know, that a man must truly hate this Germany if he really loves it. I would 10 times rather die than see you triumph. Am I crying? No. But I do. And when I do, it is out of fury and shame and not out of sadness. Every nation normally puts its demons, its delusions, its impossible desires away into the cellars and vaults and underground prisons of its unconscious. Germany has reversed the process and let them loose. The contents have escaped like the winds out of Pandora's box. A storm is raging across this long-suffering old earth. Germany, drunk with victory, is sick. Southern Germany has remained skeptical about all this Prussian noise and victory. The great majority of the workers and practically all the intellectuals are bitter opponents of the regime, and the farmers remain wedded to their old and unchangeable patterns of thinking and being, but industry pulls the strings. The instrument of power is terror, and industry holds tight to it. They control all the means of influencing public opinion and have thereby stupefied the mass. Salaried people, office workers, low-ranking government officials to the point of idiocy. It should be observed that my own viewpoint is that of a conservative, and further observed that between this viewpoint and that of the nationalist is a chasm as wide as a fucking canyon. To be a conservative means to believe in the immutable laws of this old earth, this earth that will begin to shake and quake when the day comes to cleanse itself of all this filth. I am required to deify this Reich. I am supposed to sing in praise of deceit, of murder, of treaty breaches. I am supposed to join in the shrieks and the jubilant shouts as the enemy falls like a torch from his exploding aeroplane. In a Berlin cinema recently, I saw the newsreel in which Hitler, standing in front of the historic railway carriage in the forest of Combiègne, is greeted with the news of the capitulation of France and begins to dance on one foot like a... I've never been so ashamed of my countrymen as I was there in that cinema. Surrounded by the clamour of a mob in ecstasy at the sight of its hopping fury, I got up and I left. I was supposed to do that hopping filth the honour of applauding it. If I had given any clearer expression of what I was really thinking, I would most surely have been lynched. What price of forest? If the national interest calls for a factory, a German cathedral if it stands in the way of an Autobahn. Of course, IG Farben welcomed Hitler. He gave their poison factory the aura of a philosophy, nationalism, a state of mind in which you do not love your own country so much as you hate somebody else's under its aegis. Under its aegis, morality decays, ancient customs die out, man is uprooted, the steadfast derided, the thoughtful branded, rivers poisoned, forests destroyed. On my way home from Villach, I stopped at the quarry, shimmering in the autumn sun. The sand viper, about to take its midday siesta, was crawling into the protective shadows of the rocks. I looked at it for a long time, and the brightly colored reptile looked back at me through its intelligent, knowledgeable, weird and mutely mournful eyes. There's a legend at home that these reptiles were created out of the old and ever-renewed earth to suck up all the acids and the poisons that ooze out of the evil that results from human cruelty and out of all our sins.